say, but I look after the community engagement here in Trinity, and this part of Trinity we now call Trinity East. But this unit is about opening up Trinity to our neighbours, trying to get to know people, working with the community on what they need and what they can use this space for, everything from residence groups to youth groups, Vincent de Paul, we've art groups. And this is the second of a series of 4 talks across a range of subjects, as you'll see from the flyer. There's some down the table there. And we aim to do it twice a year. So in March and September, October, we'll have 4 to 6 talks. So just a quick thanks to Betty Ash, as always, and Lorraine Malone, who did all the hard work in getting people here. And to my colleague Jenny Kirkwood down there, taking all your details if you haven't already. And Dylan, of course, our video guy. And of course, really what you're here for, and thank you to Professor Frank Barry, who's taken time out to come along. And it's great to have him here. So he's Professor of International Business and Economic Development at Trinity Business School, member of the Royal Irish Academy. He's held positions well-travelled across universities, Stockholm, California and New South Wales, and with Harvard Institute for International Development. His current research interests are in the fields of foreign direct investment and economic and business history. He grew up in Raheny and was educated in O'Connell. So we look forward to, and he'll do a talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be plenty of time after his presentation for your questions and comments. So thank you, Frank.
Okay, thank you very much. You can all hear me okay? Yeah, great. So this is the fruit of about 20 years' work. It won't seem like it. This just all seem like quite straightforward stuff, but it took me about 20 years to compile the database from which the information that I'm presenting here today is drawn. And basically what I did over that, I would never have taken on this project if I knew it was going to take me 20 years, but it has ended up with this publication, which came out 2 days after Christmas for some reason. It's an academic publication, so it's priced at 70 quid sterling, so I don't expect you all to be rushing out to buy it, but there are copies in the public library system, so if you want to follow up, you know, you can order it from the public library. Now, the talk today, I'm basing it entirely on images, and largely images of factories. There are no images in the book. The book is all text, right? So it's an academic book, you know, but there's information on loads and loads of firms. Now, today I'm going to focus primarily on just the biggest manufacturing firms. That is, manufacturing firms that employ 500 workers or more. Now, if you employ 500 workers today, you're not a huge firm. That's like a medium-sized firm. But back in the 1920s, Ireland was very under-industrialised. It was primarily an agricultural economy. So there weren't that many big firms. There was only about 20 manufacturing firms employing 500 workers or more at that time in the 20s. And by the 1970s, there was only about 70 or 75. I'm only going to mention a selection of them today. I'm going to focus primarily on Dublin ones. And I know from chatting with a few of you already that these will be familiar to you. They might well all be familiar to you. So there's a database that goes with this that I've put up online that I'll alert you to at the end of the slide if you want to look up something more on these firms without having to buy the book, right? That's the important proviso. There's a reason I mentioned in that brief bio that I'm from Raheny. Raheny will come up here. Fortunately, I won't be focused entirely on Raheny, you'll be glad to say, but Raheny comes up in an important way. So like I say, I'm focusing only, I can't even mention all of the firms that employed 500 workers or more. You know, I can only mention a selection. So there are lots of others that were major firms, and if you want to ask me about them afterwards, like I mentioned to a few people, I have a database of 5,000 firms. So people come up to me afterwards and they say, have you heard of this firm, that firm, and the other firm? And even ones I haven't heard of, I say, well, it'll be in my database and I can look it up afterwards, you know? So that's pretty much of value. So this is the cover image of the book. It shows Sean Lemass, right, here in the 1930s, Fianna Fáil Minister for Industry and Commerce, and obviously later Taoiseach. The reason I look at the photograph, of course, is the priest opening the factory with the top hat. So this is from opening a leather factory in the 1930s in Waterford. So I had suggested several images to the publishers that they might choose for the front cover. This is the one that they chose, but I'll just show you briefly some of the other images that I offered them. This one is a photograph that my wife took. It's of an Odlums building, but it's actually in Cork City. I was down in Cork last week. The building still stands, but the Odlum sign is gone. But it's a magical sign, isn't it? So, like, it's an owl, which is the Odlum family crest, right? But it's very appropriate for a flour miller that they have an owl to catch vermin and everything else. So I'm afraid that building is going to be knocked, because Cork cares as little about its old buildings as Dublin does. But anyway, that's another image. This one this is almost my favourite image. And it was mentioned, I don't know if any of you know, this was mentioned on the Graham Norton show a few months ago. Somebody mentioned Fermoy in County Cork as being a horrible town. Somebody was sitting in the red chair, you know, Graham's red chair, and mentioned Fermoy. And Graham goes, Fermoy, that's the town with the pencil in it, right? And nobody in his audience knew what he was talking about. This is what he was talking about. It's an image from 1956 when Faber-Castell opened a factory there. And Faber-Castell, the German manufacturer of what we used to call Pion Louis. Do you remember that word? The pencil factory. So that's one of my favorite images. But this one, I'd mentioned to a few of you, this one is just totally great, I think. This is the Grand Canal dock area in 1926, and it was taken from a plane, right? So the image is credited to the Irish Army Air Corps. So it shows, obviously, this is the Grand Canal dock area. That's Boland's Mills there, right? And this is the Hammond Lane Foundry. So I'd show you a later image of Hammond Lane. So obviously the site that we're on here. So anyway, that's by way of introduction to Dublin. So Ireland in 1922, the period I'm looking at, 1922 to 1972. Why I choose that period. 1922, the Irish Free State was founded. 1972 was the eve of our joining the European Economic Community. So all changed after that. But this period was also the heyday of Dublin manufacturing industry. There was little enough industry in the 1920s. By the 1970s, under protectionism, right, where both Commonwealth and Fianna Fáil introduced tariffs to stimulate industry, manufacturing employment in the country increased by about fourfold over those 50 years, so a pretty substantial increase. A lot of that increase took place in Dublin. After 1972, Dublin's heyday as a manufacturing centre was past. Industry like Jacobs was moving out to the suburbs. It moved out to Tala at that time. And the new foreign investment companies that were coming in were locating outside Dublin, generally down the country. So this 50-year period is the heyday of Dublin manufacturing. This was the huge manufacturing employer in Dublin. Do you all recognise it? Okay, well, as soon as I tell you what it is, this is, what do they call Kingsbridge Station now? Oh yeah, it was a change in 1966. I grew up calling it Kingsbridge, and I still think of it as Kingsbridge. Anyway, so that's the Guinness factory. So it's still like pretty much that same area. Today, the Guinness brewery employs around 800 workers. I checked recently. Back in the 20s, and right through this period I'm talking about, it employed 3,500. So it was a huge employer. As you will all know, you probably just didn't know the extent of its employment. So it was huge. I recently came across this map of the expansion. This is the Liffey on the north side now. In the 1850s or so, the Guinness brewery just comprised that small little area, the yellow and blue area, and it extended then over time. So in the 1850s, Guinness was famously, the brewery dates from 1759. So by the 1850s, it only employed around 500 workers. And then the massive expansion occurred over the following 50 or 70 years, from 500 to 3,500. So it was a huge employer, of course. You'll be showing your age now if I ask you this. Does anybody remember the barges going down the river? You do? Okay, because they stopped in 1961. So I don't know if it's a false memory. I would have been 5 in 1961. I have a vague memory of seeing them, but I don't know if I made that memory up. And my parents are gone, so I can't ask them. Anyway, it's a great image, I think. This is the mention of Raheny. Both of the lords, Lord Ardalaun, this is St Anne's estate in Raheny, where I grew up. And so both of the Guinness lords, Lord Ardalaun was the older brother, and Lord Ivy was the brewery proprietor. They both grew up in this estate. This is what it looked like when I was a kid. It was demolished not so many years later. So that's my sole mention of Raheny, I promise. Now, this one you probably, does anyone recognize this? When I tell you, you'll say, ah, yeah, you knew it all the time. This is a fantastic image. I discovered it only recently in the Irish Architectural Archive. It's the image of Jacobs' factory in the 1930s. This is Ainger Street down here. This makes it look like it was a Bovril factory. It wasn't. That's an advertising slogan. And over here is, that's St. Patrick's Cathedral over there, and that's Ballally back there. So this is a great image of Jacobs. This is probably more what you might remember Jacobs looking like. This is Jacobs on Ainger Street. This is what it looked like in the 70s, just when it was closing down and moving to Tala. Jacobs was a gigantic employer as well. Back in the 20s and in the period up to the 20s, it employed 3,000, so nearly as many as Guinness. And interestingly, the Jacobs workforce was primarily women and girls, whereas Guinness was almost exclusively male. Oh yeah, I was going to tell you one story. This is my favorite Jacobs biscuit. The lecture is not entirely about me, but you know. Anyway, I adore the Mikado. So the name Mikado, the biscuit companies used to compete against each other by thinking up exotic names for their varieties. So in Victorian England, there was a big wave of interest, Orientalism it was called, big wave of interest in Asia. And you'll know the Gilbert and Sullivan operetta, the Mikado. So that arrives at the same time. It was designed to appeal to this, you know, fascination with the Orient. So the Mikado was introduced in the Victorian era. There's a more interesting story about its another famous variety, Kimberley. And I discovered this only relatively recently. So Kimberley, as you probably know, is the diamond mining region of South Africa. And when there was various Boer wars going on between the British Army and the local whites, the Boers in South Africa, in the Second Boer War, the town of Kimberley, there was a British contingent there, and they were besieged by the Boer army. And it looked like they'd have to surrender. And then a British expeditionary force relieved the town from siege. That was, I think, in January 1901. The following month, February 1901, Jacobs releases its Kimberley biscuit. So every time you eat a Kimberley, you're eating a little bit of colonial history. And do you recognize this? It's like the second most expensive street on the old Monopoly board was Aylesbury. St. Michael's School. Why do I have it here? It's because this was one of the houses that the Jacob family lived in. It's kind of gorgeous. Not as prestigious, of course, as the Guinness. Well, you know, Aylesbury Road versus Raheny. I mean, there's no choice, you know. The big multinational at the time was Ford Motor Company. It was already around by the time the Free State was established, and it employed, actually there was times in the 1920s when it employed far more than Guinness because it was producing tractors, and there was huge demand for tractors. Later on it started to assemble cars solely for the Irish market, but it was a huge employer at that time as well, employed about 1,500 in around 1920. So that was the big multinational employer. Again, show your age. Anybody remember Pym Brothers department store? Fortunately, oh my God, I should stop telling stories about myself. I vaguely remember it. The reason it sticks in my head is it's the only time I was ever brought to see Santa Claus, and I was terrified. You remember, you're that young. And it was in Pym's, because Pym's was knocked in 1961, I think. It was the biggest department store of the era, which might surprise you. Like, now, we're talking pre-1920s. It employed 600 workers, so you can imagine the level of service you got shopping in a Pym's department store. So it's not a pure manufacturing firm, but as you'll see here at the bottom, it produced like Irish poplins, and it did produce various textiles and so on. So the second biggest one, again bigger than Cleary's, I'm wondering if anybody can recognise that building. Yeah, so it was called Todd Burns at the time. It's now Penny's or Primark on Mary Street. So again, it was the second biggest employer. So not a pure manufacturing firm, but look, I'm throwing it in for the crack. Okay, this one is in Harold's Cross, and it was called Greenmount. Later in the Greenmount and Boyne Linen Company. And it was a huge employer in the 1920s as well. It employed about 1,000 workers, so it was huge. That's what it looks like today. That building is still standing. Most of the surrounding buildings have been knocked, of course, but there's still a remnant of it there. This is a picture from the 1950s. I wanted to show it originally because it mentions Healy's of Dame Street, in that many of you might remember, which Healy's was selling paper and things like that, but it had a big factory around the corner on the little laneway where the Stag's Head pub is, and it employed 500 workers in the 1920s, so it was a big employer. But when I found this image, I also noticed, of course, Kennedy's Bread there, and Kennedy's was one. There was 3 huge bakery companies at the time, which you certainly know, but Kennedy's was up on Parnell Street, right? And you can see there St. Peter's Bakery. And that sign is still there because this is a photograph. Oh no, I removed it. The sign is still there anyway. It's called a ghost sign. It's a memory of, an industry that was there in the past, So if you're not familiar with wandering around the city looking for ghost signs, it opens up a total new world to you, So, Parnell Street, yeah. So there's brilliant ghost signs around the place. One of the big soft drinks company at the time was called Thwaites, T-H, and there's a ghost sign of it on O'Connell Street. And of course, many of you will remember the Lemon Sweet Company, Lemon Sweets, right? Lemon's Pure Sweets. And there's the ghost sign of the old Lemons factory on O'Connell Street is still around as well. And if you just walk around and you look at manhole covers, they'll frequently tell you the company that made them, So there's lots of Hammond Lane manhole covers, as well as, the other major companies of the time. Tongent Taggart was another local firm and so on. So I get my students to go around taking photographs of ghost signs, and they say, many of them, years and years later, will send me images of ghost signs they find in Tokyo and wherever they happen to be working. It gives them a new lease of life. It's a really fantastic hobby. Better than playing on their mobile phones anyway, So, this was the big one, Boland's. This is what the old Boland's bakery looked like. And this was what it looked like when it was De Valera's headquarters in 1916. Then, this is a great image, this was the new building that was New Boland's Bakery, which is just up the street, of course, here. That was built in the 1940s. I think that's a particularly great image. So Boland's was the really big one, and the third big one, I was going to threaten to sing the jingle for your favorite family pan. Yay, excellent. So much better than I was threatening to do. Yeah. So fantastic, isn't it, to have these old names conjured up again? Because once they disappear, you almost forget about them, and it's only when you're reminded of them that, that you realize what a major part of one's life they played. This was Smith and Company, the hosiery company in Balbriggan, and the building, the walkway is gone now, but the building still stands, and it's full of the gold medals. Balbriggan was, if you look up the Oxford English Dictionary, it says Balbriggan was another name for hosiery. The town of Balbriggan was so famous all over the world. Sometimes if you watch a John Wayne Western, you'll hear him talking, hand me over my Balbriggans, meaning give me my socks or whatever he was wearing, whatever the Indian girl he was talking to, was telling him. Anyway, so that's famous. This is a photograph of the other big hosiery factory in Balbriggan from the 1920s. that building down there, that was, even though it was English owned, it was burnt when the town was ransacked by the Black and Tans during the War of Independence. So that was the other. And all that remains, if you're travelling on the train up to Belfast or Drogheda or something like that, there's one of the big chimney stacks, smokestacks in the background remains. There's no other legacy of the factory that was there. That's Winstanley shoe shop that you'll remember. It wasn't a particularly big factory, and it was really dwarfed by the British firms that came in under tariffs that ultimately all became Clark's Shoes in County Louth. But it was the big Dublin shoe manufacturer. No, it employed only a couple of hundred. So the other firms I'm talking about were all really serious employers. That's it's kind of in the Liberties. It's where Mother Redcaps used to be. I'm not sure the name of the street. Yeah, down there. This is an image. Oh yeah, I'm going to jump to some that are not necessarily manufacturing companies, but that will trigger memories as well. This was the Inchicore Railway Works, which was a huge employer that employed a couple of thousand, you know. So that's an armoured car been built there during the Civil War. Brooks Thomas, you will remember, I'm sure, that's there beside Liberty Hall. This is an old picture of what it looks like. And the little kid here, he seems to me to be wearing a kind of leprechaun hat, but maybe that's just my failing eyesight. But that's an old picture of Brooks Thomas. Dockrell's, you'll remember. And so these were only semi-manufacturing. These were builders, providers, companies. Ted Castle's was a major coal distribution company that I'm sure many of you will remember. Heaton's, that's now a shopping, you know, whatever, hardware shops, I suppose, was another coal distribution company. So these are all companies that preceded the establishment of the state. So I'm going to go now into looking at the period of the 1920s when the Cumann and Whale government, this is W.T. Cosgrave here and his first cabinet, the companies that were established under their administration, because they introduced some tariffs. And when you put on tariffs, the idea is to stimulate domestic industry, but foreign firms that are now locked out of the domestic market jump over the tariffs and establish in your country to avoid the tariff barriers. And there was lots of important firms that started up at this time. We always think of protectionism as being instigated by Fianna Fáil. Cumann and Whale introduced certain tariffs that were very successful, and so I'll talk about some of those. The most successful ones were the tobacco ones. That's the first. So Players and Wills. Now you'll know the Players Wills factory on South Circular that I'll come to in a minute. This was the first Wills factory that opened up on Marrowbone Lane, and they rapidly discovered it wasn't big enough to cater to the domestic demand. So this was the Woodbines. Untipped, unfiltered, by far because they were really cheap, by far the most popular cigarettes of the time. Nicknamed coffin nails for obvious reasons, yeah. So, but you can see made in Bristol was where Wills was from, and Dublin. And that's the Players Wills factory that was built in 1929. So the earlier image of Wills is from the early 20s. So as soon as the state was set up, these British tobacco companies started building factories in Dublin to cater to the protected market. So even though everybody calls this the Players Wills building, Players only moved there in 1967. It was Wills throughout the period, because the first Players factory in Dublin was here in Glasnevin, that I still think of as the Smurfit building, but yeah. So Players were there for a lot of the time. Oh, I love these politically incorrect images. Cigarette packs had such beautiful images. How am I doing for time? But the other really successful tariffs that Cumann and Whale introduced were on what is called in the categories sweets, chocolates, and sugar confectionery, right? So the big jam and marmalade producer at the time and sweet firm was this Williams and Woods factory, which is still there. It's a gorgeous building if you're not familiar with it. It's just north of Parnell Street. It looks exactly like that, so it's beautiful. So it was the biggest sweet confectionery manufacturer in the country at the time. This is a later image. That shows on Parnell Street. Again, that building is demolished, of course. The Corpo did their work now. Yeah, exactly, yeah. Over by a British firm as soon as the tariffs were introduced. Actually, Cross and Blackwell, which I think was a kind of soup and sauce manufacturer, but it took over Williams and Woods. So it was a big employer. Roundtree, this is a gorgeous, this is like the old Irish script, right? I think it's beautiful. But what it says, I'm not sure if you can read it, it says, Doniena vi malal clia o milanege fische. So made in Dublin since 1926. Oh yeah, now anybody who's heard me talk before will know I love this phrase. My favorite phrase in Irish, Driocht Dove, which is a beautiful phrase, which means black magic. So Rowntree moved here in 1926, as you can see. Again, tariff jumping, like in the case of the cigarette manufacturers. It later built this in an area that's now called the Chocolate Apartments or something like that, opposite Kilmainham Jail. That was their later factory, Rowntree Macintosh. And Ernie was set up at that time. And if I don't hear a gasp of delight at the next slide, then you weren't living at the time when this chocolate bar was knocking around. Look at that. Do you remember? It's amazing. When I discovered this image a few years back, I'd forgotten completely of, my God, how good a chocolate bar that was. So that was the Ernie chocolate bar. Here's another great image. This was Lamb Brothers that had a factory out in Inchicore. Now, it wasn't a huge employer, but just when I show the Ernie image, this is an image that everybody loves as well. I lived away, as you heard earlier, for many years, and I came home one time and I having breakfast with my father, and I looked at the jar of marmalade in the front, and I said, "Da, the shaggin' cat is gone." They had removed the cat for, obvious health and safety reasons or something like that. I think they reintroduced it, but it had shrank. Anyway, that's the way I remember old-time Irish marmalade. And here's one other story about brand names. I bet you everybody has wondered at one stage where the name My Waddy comes from. It's known only to Irish people. A company was set up, Cantrell and Cochrane, C&C, the former maker Club Orange, Club Lemon. They and the other major soft drinks companies came together and formed a joint venture back in the 1920s called Mineral Water Distributors, MIWADI. That's where the name My Waddy comes from. If you remember nothing else from this talk, you'll remember the story of the My Waddy. Yeah. Oh yeah, and anyway, enough said about that. But anyway, so there are stories to be told about each of the brand names. It's amazing how long brand names survive. You know, Denny Bacon, right? Famous bacon. So established in 1820. Oh, my poor long-suffering wife. I dragged her. We were down in Waterford. I dragged her to an old derelict Church of Ireland graveyard outside Waterford, locked up. I slithered in the mud under the gates to have a look for the grave of the original Henry Denny, and found it. So the brand name still exists, but who knows who owns it? It's owned by an Australian company or something now. But the brand names, in many ways, when you talk about this stuff or you think about it, I mean, the brand names kind of have a life of their own, So I say Henry Denny, and it conjures up things immediately to people. Now, this was the Castle Forbes soap factory on Sheriff Street. That was another firm that was established in the 1920s. That was a Lever Brothers factory, and it lasted until the 1980s. Can you believe it? I took this photograph about 3 years ago. The gates are now gone, so it no longer says Castle Forbes. So the gates are gone, but they lasted until several years ago. And it makes me think, the oldest brand name in the country is the next one. This is in East Wall. John G. Rathburn, candle maker, right? Rathburns had been making candles in Dublin since the 1400s. So that is the longest established firm in Britain or Ireland. That's incredibly long. that's now a ghost sign, right? That's on East Wall Road, you might remember it. And I've been in touch with everybody saying, for God's sake, would you go in and preserve that sign? And kind of the authorities have no interest. Anyway, so it's still there, you know, but one day you'll go by and it'll be gone, you know. Oh my God, I'm spending all my time on the pre-Free State. But anyway, I don't know if you remember this. Again, if my dad bought the Irish Independent as a kid, I'd read the logo, and it used to say until the 1980s, I think it used to say, incorporating the Freeman's Journal. Do you remember ever seeing that? And the Freeman's Journal was its rival newspaper. That was its last edition. It collapsed in 1924 and was bought out by the Irish Independent. So the Irish Independent employed 500 workers back from the late 1920s when it bought out the Freeman's Journal. So it meets my criterion, you know, for being a major employer. Okay, I'm going to go to the Fianna Fáil era now. So what I've been talking about so far are firms that existed even before the establishment of the state or that came into being in the 1920s. So I'm going to talk about the Fianna Fáil. Fianna Fáil came into power in 1932, of course, under De Valera. Lemass was Minister for Industry and Commerce, and so was kind of the main determinant of industrial policy. And there was loads and loads of new firms that you'll be familiar with that were established under the early Fianna Fáil era. This is an image I discovered recently, nothing to do with Dublin, obviously, but it's the Carlow sugar factory, and I just think the haystacks and so on. So it established the Irish Sugar Company, and a lot of the other big semi-states were established under Fianna Fáil. So the Sugar Company and Éireann Foods, which was a subsidiary, these were big employers. In fact, the Sugar Company at its height employed about 4,500 workers. So, you know, huge employer. Now, I don't know if any of you will know the name Polikoff. It had a factory in Rialto. It was the biggest clothing manufacturer in like the 40s and 50s, and maybe even into the 1960s, but it later changed its name to Kilmaine. So the name Kilmaine might be more familiar to you, after Kilmainham, where its factory was on the border of Rialto and Kilmainham. So it was a British company, again, a tariff jumper that came in response to Fianna Fáil tariffs. The paper mills were resuscitated under Fianna Fáil, so the Clondalkin paper mills. No trace of Clondalkin paper mills anymore. I cycle out on my electric bike. I cycle out to Clondalkin frequently because it's within shooting distance if you're on an electric bike. No trace of the factory, which is a shame. I can remember the smokestack lasted until the 60s or 70s at least. So that was a very big employer, and in fact, it battled with Smurfit for control of the sector in the 1960s, but Smurfit eventually won that battle. Healy's was, we've seen Healy's already, the paper company. It established this big factory in East Wall. Healy Tom later became merged and were eventually taken over by Smurfit. So that was an Alexander Thom factory in Glasnevin. So I discovered, I've searched for a good image of the Hammond Lane Foundry, the site on which we are now, right? And very few and far between. This is one actually, though, I found from a newspaper in 1937. So this is the site that we're on now. So that's the view from the Grand Canal dock of the Hammond Lane. And this is the kind of evidence that I give my right arm for, it says, which occupies a site of 8 acres and employs 800 workers. So that was the maximum employment, I think, that the Hammond Lane Foundry ever had. But Hammond Lane, as you probably know, has about 10 different or 12 different companies that were all operating under the Hammond Lane name. So the foundry itself was a major employer in the early days, and later on employment shrank. But the Hammond Lane group of companies was always a big employer. And another major sector that came into being under early Fianna Fáil was car assembly. So Ford was the big car assembler in Cork. This was the big one in Dublin, which was Britain Motors. And that's up on the canal on the road to Rathmines or Ranelagh? Raheny, yeah, that's just off the canal there. Okay, I'm going to lash through my remaining slides to leave a bit of time for talk. This is John A. Costello. He set up the IDA and he introduced low corporation tax relief. So it was very much more important than he's given credit for. So Cadbury's, this was Cadbury's on East Wall, had set up in the 1930s, but when export profits tax relief, as it was called, was introduced by Costello and later taken on board by Fianna Fáil, Cadbury's built this big new factory in Coolock and started to export confectionery. So it still survives because it became an exporting company, whereas Rowntree McIntosh and Ernie always catered only to the local market, and they got wiped out by free trade. That building, by the way, the old Cadbury's building, you might remember, it became the Wiggins Teep building. And I used to cycle by it every day for 10 years or so, and then one Monday morning it was gone, and it had been knocked down. So it was a beautiful building. Phillips was in Clonskee, was one of the first major export-oriented multinationals to come into the country. So you probably remember that. Okay, I'll tell you what. I'm gonna kind of draw a halt in about 5 minutes, and I've loads more slides, you know. But I want to give a chance for people to talk. This is D.E. Williams. This is not a Dublin. This was the distiller, the Tullamore distiller. If you ever think Tullamore Dew is their major product, you think, where does the name Dew, D-E-W, come from? It's the initials of D.E. Williams. But why I have it here, and yeah, I came across this great photograph. That's of Dame Street, obviously. This was the D.E. Williams outlet that they had on Dame Street, which is lovely. Why it was so important was it cracked the American market after the Second World War. By producing Irish mist liqueur. In the early 1960s, Irish mist liqueur was selling half of the distillery products, so Irish distillery products sold in North America were Irish mist liqueur. So it cracked the North American market, and that directly triggered the major distillers, Jameson, Powers, and Cork distilleries, to come together and to form Irish distillers. So, you know, for a tiny company, it has this important legacy. So that's why I'm talking about, why I mention it there. Hughes Brothers, big company. So it was a milk distribution company, but it became HB Ice Cream that still exists, you know. And Premier Dairies and Finglas. Glen Abbey was a big textile and clothing company, of course. That was a factory on Patrick Street, but its major factory was in Tala. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap it up here. Actually, I'm just going to flick to my final slide. See, I'm talking now about a lot of the multinational factories that came in, but these didn't come into the city centre, so that's kind of where I want to talk now. So that's the opening image of what Dublin Port looked like. That's actually in 1972, so the last time was slide. But what I just wanted to say about when the multinationals came in, so they really started to come in around the early 1970s. And by that time, industry was moving out of Dublin City to the suburbs, right? Jacobs was the major move, right? In 1972, it moved by and large from the old factory site that had been on since 1853. It moved to Tala, but a lot of these other factories were moving to the suburbs. So Dublin was deindustrializing, and the IDA was pushing all these new foreign industries to locate elsewhere in the country outside Dublin. So Dublin's heyday was over, and all the major multinationals that came in at the time, like Pfizer in Cork, Lieber in Killarney, Ferenca in Limerick, you know, all of these companies, they were all outside Dublin. So Dublin's heyday as a manufacturing centre was over by 1972. So on that tragic, heartbreaking note, I'm going to stop there. And I hope you got a kick out of it. Thank you very much.
What tariff was offered as an incentive for English companies to locate in Ireland?
Okay. So basically, the Cumann and Whale government started with tariffs, right? So its major tariffs were on, as I say, on tobacco, manufactured tobacco, and on sweets and chocolate confectionery, and later on textiles, clothing. And the big footwear companies moved in under Cumann and Whale. So actually everybody thinks, who knows a little bit of history, that tariffs were introduced only under Fianna Fáil. Fianna Fáil then came into power in 1932 and basically put tariffs on everything. So manufacturing employment increased very dramatically in the 1930s, which was a great time to create jobs because the global depression was occurring. So pretty much everything was tariffed under Fianna Fáil. The problem then was, though, that at the end of the Second World War, when the rest of Europe was dropping its tariffs and embracing free trade, Ireland didn't do so. So it delayed really until the 1960s and 1970s. But I can't be more precise than that because basically everything was tariffed under Fianna Fáil.
Professor, I have a very difficult question, a very substantial question. It might be slightly outside your area of direct expertise.
That sounds like you're slagging me, but that's all right. I'm from Raheny. I can take it.
Okay, well, this is a hell of a question. How did Jacobs get the figs into the big house?
Well, I know it was Jim Figerty, wasn't it? Yeah. Somebody else had beat me to it there, but we all remember the advert. I bet you loads of people in the audience don't know what you're talking about. Anyway, they have a lot to learn. How are you?
Just wanted to know, you have a go sign in the facility here, insofar as in Mount Street, there's a signage for Goffs. Everybody know that one? Goffs horse. When I was growing up, the horse sales used to take place in Merrion Square and Hollis Road. And
Right.
The signage for Goffs is still there.
Okay. Great, thanks. Funnily enough, my students have never discovered that. I have hundreds of ghost signs that they've taken on their smartphones. That's one I'll keep an eye out for. Thanks.
I hated the taste of old Jacobs biscuits. That's personal, but Ernie's was the nicest chocolate in my opinion. Anyone agree with me?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, oh yeah, Professor Brown, that's good. But also, I actually just want to make two comments. I believe I was actually present in the Canadian factory. My first suit was an awful purple-coloured suit. And I just noticed that very groovy-looking shop front in Dane Street, D.E. Williams.
Yeah.
And what I actually noticed particularly was the number of bikes against the wall, and not very many cars. I found their shop front really nice looking. I mean, maybe even nicer than what you see today, which is all glass and all. I don't know, it was sort of, you had to look at this height, the chin height,
Yeah.
or chest height.
Well, I agree it's a lovely image, which is why I stuck it in there, even if it's not really particularly appropriate.
So I think it was absolutely fantastic to go back and look, because I think, so much has changed in Dublin over the years, and so much for us to look back and say, oh yeah, that was there, because sometimes you forget. I mean, I live at the corner there, just across the road, so Hamilane family was the wall that my brothers played football against.
Right.
So we're very much a part of the whole, like the gas company and all like that. We had all of that industry around in the area. So I just want to say thanks.
Yeah.
Bring us down memory lane.
Thanks. And it reminds me to say something. My sister, who's younger than me, said to me recently, she said, do you remember when we go into town as kids, there was always this really strong smell of coffee brewing? And I said, it wasn't coffee, that was Guinness. Do you remember? The Guinness smell used to pervade the entire city. And I talk with people who grew up near Jacobs or even near Williams and Woods. So Williams and Woods, a woman said to me, every day she'd be walking by going to school and they could tell whether it was raspberry, strawberry or gooseberry jam was being made in there. You could tell from the smells. And I give these talks in the Liberties. This is a gross metaphor, a gross a reminder now of sometimes the smells that would pervade them. Sometimes in the Liberties you get the smell from Jacobs if the wind was coming one way, from Guinness if the wind was coming the other way. But you know the overpowering smell? O'Keefe's the Knackers, as it was called.
I remember we were passing by James Street on the way up to visit my grandmother, and once we getting there, going from Thomas Street, just hit the James Street. Oh, the smell is really on, and the bus would be unbearable there.
Oh, really? Oh, I loved it.
The hobs.
Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful smell.
As a kid, I didn't like it.
Oh, right.
The hobs is really very strong.
Yeah. Just as a matter of interest, show of hands, who liked the Guinness smell and who didn't? Who liked it? Oh, and who didn't like it then? Oh, you're in a small minority. Yeah. Okay. How are you?
Thank you, that was really wonderful. Great
Thanks.
to see all the dentists. And I actually worked in the Slane, behind Dashford in the park. And there's a lot of factories along there.
Oh, behind Bachelor's Walk. Yeah.
Yes, in that Slane. And the lovely thing I remember is the sign for the vacancies. You know, and to think like now when people go for a job now, how difficult it is. And how easy it seemed to be to just walk in and nobody asked you where you're going to be in 5 years' time.
Right.
Yeah.
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 You could start the job in the morning. If you didn't like it, you could start at 2 in the afternoon.
Wow, that was great. That was great. But mind you, just before coming here now, I was attending a talk in Trinity. A young female PhD student was giving a talk about how the discriminatory wages that were paid to women, and of course the marriage bar that remained in place until the 1970s. But women, on average, were paid like around half what men were paid for the same work. You know, so. Oh, yeah.
So that's the way it goes.
Ah, yeah, that's a good point.
What I kind of find fascinating and what was brilliant, the talk was brilliant, and I'm thinking back in memories from where I worked myself, where my father worked, where my sister worked, they're all included there.
Oh, that's great.
And when I think of these companies, I don't think of foreign companies at all. When we think of foreign investment now, we think of huge companies coming in. Most of these companies would have been seen as Dublin companies. We're here so long.
Yeah.
They were just part of our
Yeah.
infrastructure.
Yeah.
They were part of what was built up in the city. We didn't see them as foreign companies.
Yeah.
As foreign companies.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the other thing, so many of them were really, really good employment.
Okay.
A lot of them were forced to pay good pay. A lot of them had really, really good staff benefits, particularly the bigger ones.
Yeah.
Sick pay before you was ever even introduced.
Yeah.
A lot of them had that. They had all kinds of sports things going on for their staff. They had social clubs going on for the staff. Things that you wouldn't even hear most of the time.
Right.
They were very progressive about it.
Did you tell me earlier you had worked for Jacobs? And Jacobs were supposed to be a very good employer, were they? Yeah.
And both the same way. There was so much stuff with the staff. They were really felt you were taken care of.
Yeah.
As a member of staff, and you know. So
Yeah.
I wouldn't have considered either of them a foreign company. Even
Oh.
though they had come in.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Now, Jacobs, of course, Jacobs weren't a foreign company, of course. Jacobs was Irish owned. But unfortunately, they had set up a company in Liverpool, a subsidiary in Liverpool, and the companies became separate. And later, the Liverpool Jacobs bought out the Irish Jacobs and closed it down. So it was a bit like your child coming back and shooting you in the head.
But one of the areas you didn't cover was around the manufacturing, the sewing factories.
Oh, yeah.
That was huge, a huge area of employment for women in Dublin.
Yeah.
Until the common market trade came in
Yeah.
and changed the whole
Exactly,
thing,
yeah.
But it was huge.
Yeah.
And as Bernie said, you could go from one week, move somewhere, work in a place for a few weeks and get your holiday money and leave and go to another. I remember someone told me from this area, the money was very short at the time, and she'd work until it came to the holidays, then she'd get her holiday money and leave and go to another job. So it was a great way of getting a few extra.
Great.
You know.
Great. But you're right to point out, you see, when we joined the common market, ultimately ultimately it was very good for us, but it took a long time for the benefits to show up. Because all of those big companies that I've talked about here, pretty much almost all of them, Guinness is still here obviously, but almost all of them closed down within 15 years of our joining the EEC, you know. And new companies came in, but that adjustment was pretty painful, you know. Yeah. Thanks for the reminder, yeah. Clearly there was, textiles, clothing and footwear were huge employers at that time, and they basically all got wiped out when we joined the common market.
Just a question, following on from what Bernie was saying, the bigger employers who provided the social support and all that, were the majority of them from the based in Quakers?
The Quakers were well known as being very good employers, and Jacobs were Quakers, and yeah, the Quakers had a particularly good reputation. The chocolate companies tended to be Quaker companies as well, but Guinness, of course, had a pretty good reputation too, and they were Church of Ireland, so it wasn't exclusively Quakers.
Right, thank you.
Can I just ask a quick question? How many people did you say have been employed in Hamilton previously?
So the photograph that I showed there, is this? The photograph that I showed there was from 1937, and it said 800 workers. That's the high point of the foundry, though. I've never found it to have employed anywhere near that number at any other time. So there may have been special circumstances. But the Hammond Lane company overall, like I say, was much more than the foundry. There was about 10 or 12 Hammond Lane companies. So it was a very big employer in total. Oh, forgot to tell you, there is the database containing all the companies I talked about here and loads more, containing the employment numbers, is freely available. If you just Google Barry Industrial, I think I have it. Oh yeah, sorry, I can show you the database here. Barry Project, yeah.
That data on Irish industrial history.
Oh, you've Googled it already, have you? Excellent. There you go. Yeah, excellent. That's exactly it. Yeah, Barry Project, firm level data. That will get you through to it. Yeah. Thanks. That's not required. Thanks, Mary.
The inner city in some factories. I worked around the inner city when I was younger. In some factories in Mary Street, a lot of Jewish factories, a lot of Jewish people.
Yeah.
And then when I left there, I went in 1966, there was a Dublin Manufacturing Company. And Manx owned that and others. So that was down the Alexander Road, and that was my first union job.
Right.
So I went from a sewing factory where it was £2.05, and we started in the union job with £6.
Wow. God Almighty.
And the perks was unbelievable.
Oh, that's like winning the sweeps.
Couldn't believe it. Like, proper canteen, you weren't sitting in a machine having your lunch. Proper canteen. There was social summit, so we had to do dinner dances and everything. So it was brilliant.
Okay, don't forget the restroom. Tell them about the restroom.
Oh yeah. When I was 1966, I was 16 and brought down there. My father would let me go down with things in the dock, and he was on the docks. He said, "You can't go to work in the docks. There's no women on the docks." I said, "You have to tell me to get a union job, and I'm not to get one." And it's down the docks. He said, "You can't go." And it was more than the house, and I was let go eventually. I had to go and get the bus down, one an hour down the docks. And when I got on the bus stop, I knew all the dockers because they all knew my father.
Yeah.
I never had to pay a bus fare, and I don't every month.
That's like what you were saying.
Yeah, I'd be handing sandwiches and everything. Anyway, the great room was so well looked after down there.
Yeah.
It wasn't sort of a dangerous place. But anyway, when I was finally brought down to work there, when finally given the job after me hounding them, I was given the job. And when I went down there, he brought me through and said, "This is the restroom." I said, "The restroom?" He said, "You have little beds there. When you're not well during the month." Is what she was talking about.
Wow.
Like that was the sewing factories where you had to sit and have your lunch at the thing.
Yeah.
There wouldn't be proper toilets or anything.
Right.
So the difference when you got down there then, you know, it was like, I never forget, it was like a little Dalek in the middle of the room when I walked into this restroom. I said, "What's that?" And she said, "That's a handy Andy." I said, "What's that for?" I said, "That's for drying your hands." I was like, it was unbelievable now, and it was an awful looking building because it was big silos, big flour silos.
I think it's a gorgeous. It's the building that's still on exists. Oh, I think it's gorgeous.
I walked in there in 1976, and it's mostly all men in big brown, desperate damn uniforms on.
Yeah.
They didn't want women in. Anyway, I got in.
What? That's amazing to treble your salary and from moving from one job to another.
I probably found everywhere with us on interviews. I say, I do this and she'll pack. My dad never spoke. I used to do all the yaping. I used to do interviews maybe 2 a day sometimes. We start the job one day and start on another day. Anyway, I said, she'll pack and all this, and the man said, yeah. And I said, my father would say to me, don't be asking the money. But that time the first thing he did was ask the money. He didn't ask what the job was.
Right.
So I said to him, how much is the money? And he said, £6 pension. And I said, oh, that's an extra pound. I'm fine in between us.
Yeah.
And then I thought, no, really, let me know. He said, no, £6 pension each.
Oh, that's incredible.
That's the price of like going to
Wow. Fantastic.
Then we got a thing to go to O'Connor's, Nappy Street, to get jeans and an overall. 1966, you couldn't get jeans here.
Oh, yeah.
I bought Wranglers and I went out dancing. So it's completely different. You walk different factories, different areas and different rates.
Yeah.
You walk in a union job, you're laughing.
Yeah.
You know.
That's great. Well, great. I mean, congratulations.
For coming to the end, unless there's any final, but clearly, Frank, great job. That was really interesting. Fantastic hour, and thanks very much again for taking
Thanks. And thanks for the stories and the comments and the questions afterwards, because I always learn things. This is why one of the reasons I love presenting is I always learn things, And, it adds to kind of the context of what I'm talking about, because I only worked in a factory for 2 weeks in my life in Lyons in London, and I hated it. I went out and worked on the buildings and got much more money as well, so I didn't like factory life.